Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our event, Using Evidence to Inform Social Policy in the Philippines in the Time of COVID-19. This is part of our larger RECOVR webinar series, where we share what we and our partners are learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're very happy to have you all join us today, not only from the Philippines, but from across the world. I'm Peter Srouji. I'm the Senior Research Manager at IPA Philippines, and I'll be moderating today's event. So just two things before we begin. I want to let everyone know that there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the session. So you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So at any time you can actually write your questions here, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of the session. Secondly, just so you know, this event will be recorded and available after the session, especially for those who were not able to attend. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our 5 speakers today. So first, we're going to have Dr. Elliott Collins, who's IPA's Director for Poverty and Measurement, and he will discuss IPA's RECOVR initiative. Then we'll have Nassreena Sampaco-Baddiri, who's IPA Philippines Country Director, and she will present the results of the recent RECOVR survey in the Philippines. She'll present the results along 3 themes. So there's social protection, financial resilience, education, and economic activity and employment. And then the following speakers will give reactions to these findings and discuss policy implications along these themes. So we're very happy to have Mariel Bayangos. She's the Division Chief at the Department of Education's Planning Service in the Policy Research and Development Division. So she will react to the education findings. And then we'll have Dr. Aniceto Orbeta, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and a longtime IPA researcher. He'll give his reaction to the findings on economic activity and employment. And last but not least, we'll have Raquel Celeste, who's a statistician at the Department of Social Welfare and Development's Policy Development and Planning Bureau. And she will give her reaction to findings on social protection and financial resilience. I'd also like to just quickly recognize the work of our research coordinator, Yuna Liang, research associate, Isa Fernandez, Shio Guo, and the team of surveyors who worked so hard to quickly implement a very successful RECOVR survey in the Philippines. So next slide, please. So before we dive in, I'd like to briefly introduce IPA and our mission for those of you who aren't as familiar. So as you're all aware, extreme poverty remains a widespread and urgent problem. The global community spends billions of dollars every year to tackle poverty-related issues, and it's critical that these resources are channeled towards efforts that have the highest impact to measurably improve lives. However, the international development community spends very little to identify what these impactful programs and policies are. So in fact, it's estimated that research and development actually make up less than 1% of resources dedicated by the international development community. So simply put, IPA exists to help address this problem. So as part of our mission, we are committed to generating rigorous evidence of what works to best improve the livelihoods of the poor. Though we don't just conduct research for the sake of research, but we really try to make sure that evidence is used by working very closely with policymakers and development practitioners throughout the process. By doing this, we really try to bridge the gap between research and policy in order to fulfill our vision of a world with more evidence and less poverty. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, you may have heard that 3 researchers whose work was foundational to our approach won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and IPA's role was acknowledged by the committee. Next slide, please. So to speak a little bit more about what our projects look like, we work across sectors, across from agriculture, education, financial inclusion, and peace and recovery. We've done this in over 850 evaluations across the world, mostly focusing on the 22 countries where we have a long-term presence, including the Philippines. But as you'll note today, we don't do any of this alone. We work in very close partnerships with hundreds of the best researchers from around the world, and we also work closely with partners that are actually delivering programs, including government, NGOs, and the private sector. This work simply wouldn't be possible without these deep partnerships. And in the Philippines, we have many longstanding partnerships with many government departments, such as Department of Social Welfare and Development, with whom we've been working since 2011, I believe, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor and Employment, the Supreme Court, the Department of Agrarian Reform, just to name a few. So I think this is an indication of how seriously the government is taking research to help inform government policies. And as an example of how we're collaborating with these partners, many of them actually provided really helpful and thoughtful feedback on our RECOVR survey instruments, which was then incorporated into their design. So that's just one small example of how we approach our partnerships. We don't just work with our partners at the end of a project during the dissemination of findings. We really work closely together throughout the research process. So now I'd like to hand it off to Elliott, who will discuss our RECOVR initiative.
Thank you, Peter. So I'd like to just introduce the RECOVR project at IPA more generally before we get into the weeds of some of the specific findings. And then I'll discuss a few of the key takeaways that we think are most important based on the results we've gotten thus far. So the first is that the RECOVR project started as an effort at not just doing our own research, but coordinating across researchers to understand as best as we can what's being learned and what questions are being asked across different national and international organizations. So we've partnered with the International Growth Center, with the World Bank, with a number of academics and national policy organizations to make sure that the RECOVR hub at the IPA website is as complete a possible picture as we can get as to what are the research and policy lessons being learned by the research community across the world. And the second part of that, which we're going to be talking about today, is that we're adding to this an important primary research and data collection component in which we've fielded a series of random digit dialing surveys to get a snapshot in as many countries as possible of what is the state of the pandemic, what is the state of the economic situation for households who are dealing with various economic and social ramifications, and what are some potential avenues for reducing the extent of harm done by lockdowns, done by social distancing measures, and the various efforts that have taken place to reduce the severity of the pandemic itself. And then finally, after that, as Peter mentioned, our major priority is making sure that insofar as we have useful insights to bring to bear on important policy questions, that we're getting those lessons out to the people who need them most in national governments, in international organizations, and in more local policymaker decision-making processes. And so that goes to both our efforts at disseminating our own findings, as well as making accessible as possible the findings of other research organizations. So in this case, we're going to talk about some of the major takeaways of a survey that was completed in the Philippines, starting in mid-June and extending to early July. So for context, when we present these findings, you should understand this as the state of the world a number of weeks ago in mid-June and early July when we were asking these questions. One of the major takeaways that we had thus far was that the majority of individuals that we spoke to who were employed in February were doing less work when we talked to them than they were in February. So we asked everybody, were you working at all? Did you have any sort of productive activity engaged on a daily basis? And if so, are you working less now? Are you making less money now? And yeah, in general, we see reports of a significant drawback of economic activity, both in terms of the number of people who are employed at all and how much work those employed people are doing. So the second thing that we found was that in terms of public response, the vast majority, 89% of households report having received some kind of transfer from the government in response. So insofar as there's been a social safety net response by the government, it's had very broad coverage. Now that doesn't answer the intensive question of not just how many people are you reaching, but to what extent are you improving their lives? To what extent are the transfers big enough, or perhaps too big? But we definitely found that the vast majority of people we spoke to had received some sort of support from the government. Of the people who said they'd received some kind of support, almost all of them, 97%, said they had received some sort of food transfers, whereas nearly half of them reported receiving some kind of cash transfer. And of course, one particular cash transfer program dominated among the government cash transfer programs we asked about. So the last thing in terms of the economic impact of these policies are that these reductions in employment and these reductions in income do seem to have some kind of implications for household well-being, and in particular food security. So 26%, 1 in 4 respondents that we spoke to, said that they had to limit portion sizes at meal times at least once in the past week. And of those who said at least once, most of them said it was most days that they were drawing back on the amount of food that was being consumed in the household as a result of, in the past week. We don't know why, but I think it's reasonable in context to surmise that the significant reduction in economic activity, and essentially what's most likely a recession of some kind, has had some of that impact. And so finally, moving on from the economic impacts of the crisis, we asked also about education. And one of the most interesting results I think that we found was that when we asked, say, instead of opening up in person as usual, schools were offering distance learning, what would be the major barrier to your child's education under those circumstances? And there were a wide range of barriers that were cited. Many people mentioned that they didn't know what sort of support from teachers or from schools they would be getting. Many said that they may not have the motivation or just the space in their internal household time budget to devote to education. But in fact, the most common response in terms of barriers to at-home education and distance learning were internet access, digital device access, and access to learning materials like textbooks. That is in contrast to some of the other places where we've spoken, where internet access sort of was a non-issue and wasn't taken as a terribly important feature. But here it seems to be very much top of mind when we ask about education. So just going back to the survey information, I mentioned that we started on the 18th of June and went to July 1st, which is to say, as a caveat, some of these things may have changed. We're in the process of figuring out what a second round of this survey will look like to ask follow-up questions. And that's certainly something that we're actively thinking about. So if people have specific questions in this seminar that they'd like to ask, or that they think should be included in a follow-up survey, that's definitely something we're interested in. The other thing that we need to make very clear of is that this was done by way of random digit dialing. So this is the industry standard way of, especially on short notice when you can't walk into somebody's household, the industry standard way of getting something like a nationally representative sample of a population. The issue is that it's a nationally representative sample of registered phone numbers with service coverage, which is to say that a number of people don't have cell phones, or their cell phones are typically off, or they're typically not in range where they would get a phone call from our system. Those people simply weren't covered here. And so in that way, it is just from the start, not technically a nationally representative survey. We'll talk about the selection biases that we saw, comparing it to census data, and some of the things we've done to adjust for it, but that's an important thing to understand. Yeah, so the major biases in this sampling method are consistent across across countries, are that you find people who are more urban, more educated, and younger, as a rule. So in particular, we see that the average age of an adult citizen in the Philippines is, or rather of a household head in the Philippines, is much older. Now I say 32 versus 52 years old. The average age of an individual adult in the Philippines is not 52. That's the average age of a household head, which is a different thing. So that isn't quite as big a gap as you might expect. Female, for example, also, there are, this in particular, we spoke 70% of the people that we got to finish the survey were female. And so that's important to caveat as well, that roughly half of the people in the country are, of course, female. More educated as well. So when we say 52 versus 25%, this is the number of people who had completed, I believe the number of people who had completed more than secondary education. And then finally, urban. There were more people living in urban areas. This is a little harder to quantify, just because it's a little harder to say what is or is not an urban area, or whether or not we're talking in comparable terms across them. But I will say that this was, generally speaking, a little more balanced than in terms of urban and rural than we saw in other places. So with that in mind, I would say that we did some work also to adjust for this. So this is an important caveat to our findings thus far. But what I will say is that, at least qualitatively, the differences were not terribly drastic when we spoke about unweighted versus weighted analysis. So one thing you can do to adjust for this is, for example, to consider the women in your sample less, because you have more of them, and so you take the averages and you make sure that the sum total of all the men in your sample account for half of the weight of the average in the sample. And similar weighting techniques can be done to adjust for the younger, the more educated nature of the population. We felt that this would be a little less transparent, and that is a little more straightforward just to present the results as they are. But it is worth noticing that when we did that weighted analysis, by and large, these dynamics persisted. So qualitatively, some of these dynamics that we'll be talking about here got a little larger or a little smaller. But for example, the conclusion that the vast majority of people have received some kind of government transfer, the fact that food security has significantly decreased across the country, those things appear to be true even in this more urban sample, even when we're adjusting for selection bias as best as we can. So. Yeah, so this, I won't dwell on this too much. The next speaker may, but I just wanted to present this as a way of understanding what the timing of our survey was when we were speaking, and importantly, all the things that had happened ahead of time. So yeah, so thank you.
Right. Right, thank you, Elliott and Peter. Again, I am Nassreena Sampaco-Baddiri, and I'm here to share the highlights of the RECOVR survey in the Philippines. And Elliott mentioned, in this timeline, we're trying to situate as well the survey within the different policies that were implemented since the time that COVID started affecting the Philippines. So as you can see, from March 15th, Metro Manila and other urban centers in the Philippines were placed under enhanced community quarantine or lockdown measures due to increasing number of COVID-19 cases in the country. During this time as well, the school year in the Philippines ended in March, and the start of the summer break coincided with the implementation of the ECQ. The government also rolled out the Social Amelioration Program in April of 2020 of this year. The ECQ was extended further in April and was ended around May 15th, where we saw a gradual easing of quarantine measures until June 1st. Metro Manila and other parts of the Philippines were then placed under general community quarantine. And as you can see in this slide as well, sorry, just going back to that, the RECOVR survey, as Elliott mentioned, was conducted during the GCQ period from June 18th to July 1st. Okay, and so we'll be discussing 3 modules in the RECOVR survey, and these are the social protection and financial resilience, education, economic activity, and employment. Okay, and so under social protection and financial resilience, we had some key questions that were included in the module, such as how the pandemic affected people's income sources. Did households have access to emergency funds? How did people cope with the financial challenges caused by the pandemic? And are people receiving government or non-governmental support? To mitigate the effects of COVID-19 quarantine measures on poor and vulnerable households, the government rolled out an emergency subsidy program called the Social Amelioration Program. The first tranche of SAP was rolled out in April, and the second tranche was recently rolled out in July, mainly using digital payments. Target beneficiaries were mainly vulnerable sectors in the country, as well as conditional cash transfer beneficiaries as well. Next slide, please. Social protection programs definitely are quite relevant at this time, given what we've been seeing in the results of the survey. Due to a loss or reduction of incomes, we've observed a large number of respondents saying that they have had to deplete savings to pay for food, healthcare, and other expenses, and that's about 7 out of 10 respondents. Respondents with school-age children are more likely to say that they borrowed money. They were not certain that they could actually pay back on time, or maybe they skipped making a required payment on a loan, or bought fewer inputs than planned to pay for food, healthcare, and other expenses since February 2020. Poorer respondents are also more likely to say that they borrowed money they were not certain that they could not pay back on time in order for them to pay for food, healthcare, and other expenses since February 2020. Next slide, please. At the same time, households across the country experience difficulties in terms of buying the usual amount of food because of decreased income. And that's about 7 out of 10 respondents in this survey. Poorer respondents are likelier than wealthier respondents to say that they had difficulty buying the amount of food that they usually buy because of a drop in household income, or maybe the price of food was too high. Respondents with school-age children are also more likely than those without school-age children to say that they had difficulty buying the amount of food they usually buy because of a decrease in their incomes. Next, please. There seems to be some improvement, as you see in the slide, to access to formal accounts in the Philippines, which has been an issue in terms of financial inclusion here. And more than half of our respondents say that they have access to an account where they can make and receive payments. Respondents with or without school-age children are both similarly, reporting that they have access to an account where they can make and receive payments. However, it is important to note that poorer respondents are less likely to say that they have an access to an account where they can make and receive payments. Interestingly, from the survey results, we see that the Cordillera region or CAR, Region 4B, and Region 11 were most likely to report having access to an account where they make or receive payments. Next. We observe as well that 89% of households, almost 9 out of 10 respondents in the survey, have received support from the government in response to COVID-19 in the following ways. Of those that are receiving support from the government, 97% are receiving food and 45% are receiving cash. Households with school-age children are more likely to have received support from the government in response to COVID-19. And of those that are receiving support from the government, households with and without school-age children are similarly likely to have received both food and cash. Households older or younger than 60 are similarly likely to have received support from the government during this time. And also poorer and wealthier respondents also are similarly likely to have received support from the government in response to COVID-19. Women are slightly more likely than men to have received support from the government, while 45% of households report receiving cash payments from the government that they do not usually receive. A third of households, meanwhile, have received non-governmental support as well in response to COVID-19 from the following sources. As you can see in the slide, almost 25% have received support from their relatives in the country, which is very typical of Filipino culture as well. Men are more likely than women to have received non-governmental support in response to COVID-19. Poor and wealthier respondents are also similarly likely to have received non-governmental support. And of those who have received non-governmental support in response to COVID-19, poor respondents are more likely to receive this support from their employer. Respondents with or without school-age children are similarly likely to have received non-governmental support as well in response to the COVID crisis. And of those who received non-governmental support, respondents without school-age children are also more likely to have received the support from their employer. Given these results, there are a number of policy implications in terms of social protection and financial resilience. Almost 9 out of 10 households have received governmental support in response to the crisis. During this period, mainly in the form of food and cash assistance. We also see that more than half of respondents say that they had to deplete their savings to pay for food and expenses and had difficulty buying their usual amount of food. Given the nature of the pandemic, question is, how can we make sure households have the resources they need for a prolonged period? We also observe that poor respondents are likelier than wealthier respondents to report having to borrow money for food, healthcare, and other expenses since February of this year. Are we providing adequate support to those who need it most? Lastly, while we see promising numbers in terms of access to bank or mobile money accounts, poorer households are less likely to receive or make payments. How can government partners increase usage of these accounts among the poor to provide economic relief? At this point, I'm happy to call on Raquel Celeste from the DSWD to share with us some information about DSWD Social Amelioration Program and also how results of these surveys are helpful for DSWD. Raki?
Thank you, Nash. Good day to the participants and my fellow panelists, Dr. Orbeta, Dr. Elliott Collins, and Ms. Mariel Bayangos. First, thank you IPA for inviting me to share my perspectives and contribute to the discussions in behalf of the Department of Social Welfare and Development. I am certain that the results of the RECOVR Survey Philippines will contribute to the ongoing efforts of DSWD in responding to the social protection needs of the Filipinos affected by the pandemic. The evidence produced by the survey will be used to influence our policies and programs to make them more responsive to the complex development challenges that our country is currently facing. Indeed, the survey was able to identify opportunities on how the DSWD's response and recovery mechanisms will be elevated to reach all our target beneficiaries and deliver the right amounts of social protection packages in an effective and efficient manner. In particular, the findings will guide us in developing remedial strategies to improve the implementation of the Social Amelioration Program, which is the largest emergency subsidy program implemented by the government of the Philippines to cushion the effects of the crisis. With the serious threats posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the government of the Philippines had to instigate aggressive social protection measures to reduce the negative effects of the pandemic on the overall well-being of the Philippines. To further escalate the response to the pandemic, President Rodrigo Duterte declared an enhanced community quarantine over the entire Luzon. The expected socioeconomic impacts of the ECP, coupled with the pandemic's health threats, called for the immediate formulation of the Social Amelioration Program led by the Department of Social Welfare and Development. The Social Amelioration Program, or SAP, aims to provide cash aid to 18 million low-income families in the countries. Through the program, low-income families receive emergency subsidies amounting to 5,000 to 8,000 pesos twice for some beneficiaries. This program was implemented in two tranches. The first tranche of subsidies was provided from April to June, while the second tranche of assistance started in June and still ongoing. But despite the various pandemic response programs implemented by the Philippines, it was acknowledged to the RECOVR survey that much remains to be done in terms of reducing vulnerabilities and at the same time improving the resilience of the Filipinos physically and financially. The findings showed us that in the long run, the government would continuously need to improve the financial capacities of the Filipinos, particularly building their capacity to save and secure emergency funds, which they could use to cope with various crises. Based on the survey, 70% of the respondents say that they have had difficulty buying the amount of food they usually buy because household income has dropped. Similarly, the same proportion of respondents had to deplete their savings because of the pandemic. So based on these findings, cash transfer programs such as Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program could be redesigned in such a way that financial behavior and practices such as saving money of the beneficiaries could be improved. On food security, the findings were also indicative that food security is at risk and that hunger incidents will suddenly rise if appropriate measures are not implemented in a timely manner. Following the drop in incomes and loss of livelihoods, the government should swiftly act to prevent involuntary hunger. On SAP implementation performance. In terms of SAP implementation performance, the findings indicate that the SWD has to further improve the timeliness of provision of cash aid and ensure that the subsidy indeed reaches its intended beneficiaries. Based on the results, only around half of the respondents received cash aid, which could mean that the actual beneficiaries reached by SAP during the time of the survey is so much lower than expected. This could be due to the delays in the provision of assistance. During this crisis, time is a critical element in implementing response programs because the pandemic impacts that we are experiencing is a function of time, and the future will depend based on how fast we respond or we react to the crisis. Also, a factor that we could investigate further in the future is if the subsidies were indeed received by all the intended beneficiaries. We could do so by improving our validation and grievance mechanisms. Another way of improving the implementation performance of SAP is by enhancing digital payments mechanisms, which would involve both government and non-government partners. However, as the RECOVR findings imply, the government has to ensure that the financial accounts and platforms will be accessible to beneficiaries, especially to the poor. Another important consideration in the delivery of social protection measures is ensuring that they are equitable. As the findings have shown us, there was no significant difference between poor and wealthier families in terms of support received. Perhaps in the future, provision of emergency subsidies similar to SAP, the DSWD shall consider providing higher amounts of subsidies to the poor, including the Pantawid families. The government of the Philippines has already achieved so much in developing and implementing social amelioration measures for the vulnerable Filipinos affected by the pandemic. Still, much remains to be done to reduce the effects of the crisis to the overall well-being of the Filipinos. Admittedly, Philippine government agencies face difficulties in combating risks associated with COVID-19, but with the increasing appreciation and use of evidence within the government, opportunities for strengthening the country's social protection system to fight the impacts of the pandemic abound in the foreseeable future. Thank you for your attention and good day to all.
Thank you so much, Raki, for those insights. Now let's jump in on the education section of the RECOVR survey. In this section, we ask respondents with school-age children at home a couple of questions regarding their concerns in the current context, the main barriers to school enrollment, and their perceived challenges to distance learning, among others. To ensure continuity of learning among public school basic education students, the Department of Education has issued a basic education learning continuity plan for this school year. This outlines guidelines for the adoption of distance learning modalities given the new start of the school year in October. Please note that in the Philippines, the President has declared no face-to-face classes until a COVID-19 vaccine is made available at some point of the year or next year. But by January 2021, low-risk areas in the country may be considered to start face-to-face classes. During the period of the survey, enrollment in basic education schools were ongoing, with late enrollment allowed until the end of September, right before the October start date. As you can see in the slide, respondents say that their main concerns regarding children in their household are children falling behind in education and children getting sick. Again, it is important to note that that school has been out since March, which is the typical end of the school year in the Philippines. And this coincided with the implementation of the lockdown measures. And so this slide, we see that a third of respondents are quite concerned about children falling behind in education, while another third of respondents were concerned with children getting sick. Men and women similarly say that their main concerns regarding children in the household are children falling behind education and children getting sick. Okay. results suggest that parents in the country face difficult decisions during this time, while 60% of respondents indicated that children would have already been, enrolled in basic education. 20% have reported or indicated that their children would not enroll in school. Note that in June, enrollment was ongoing, and the Department of Education has allowed late enrollment as well until and the last week of September. Of those who would not enroll their children, 88% cited concerns over school safety. Okay. In terms of the challenges that children might face as schools do not open and offer distance learning, respondents cite lack of access to the internet. As Elliott mentioned, this seems to be a very important concern in the country compared to other countries who run the survey as well. Devices as well was cited as a concern by our respondents, as well as other learning materials, which have been seen as one of the main barriers, the lack of access to the internet, devices, and other learning materials. Poor respondents were also more likely to cite lack of access to internet, devices, and learning materials as the major barriers that children will face in distance learning. Given these challenges, respondents indicate that the Department of Education can support children by helping with internet access and virtual classes, as well as receiving materials. Poorer and wealthier respondents are similarly likely to indicate that the Department of Education or DepEd can help with internet access and virtual classes to support children. Given concerns on children getting sick and falling behind in education, we see a preference as well for online learning and homeschooling using modules as the preferred distance learning modalities among households. We observe that wealthier respondents are more likely than poorer respondents to cite online learning as their preferred distance learning modality for their children. Okay, next. We see a number of policy implications in education. Respondents, as you've seen, are most concerned about children falling behind education. And so how can we ensure that children are not falling behind? How can we assist parents and guardians as they support their child's learning at home? We also observe a preference for children to take online classes, but lack of access to the internet as well as devices remain as major challenges when classes start in October. Implications to early childhood development and nutrition is also important to consider, given that households with school-age children experience and report difficulties in accessing food, paying for food, healthcare, and other expenses. Respondents with school-age children are more likely than those without children to say that they've had difficulty buying the amount of food that they usually buy because household income has decreased. How can government partners provide adequate support to address these financial constraints? To share with us DepEd's plans to ensure continuity of learning, I'd like to call on Mariel Bayangos from the Policy Research and Development Division of DepEd. Mariel?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. First, I'd like to thank the Innovations for Poverty Action for organizing this event, and I'd like to congratulate in advance my co-panelist, Ms. Raquel Celeste from DSWD, Sir Bibbs Orbeta from PIDS, Nash, Sampaco-Baddiri, Dr. Elliott Collins, and Peter Srouji. So the Department of Education congratulates IPA in conducting the research for effective COVID-19 response. This is an important body of evidence as we are designing our education policies and programs in preparation for the opening of school year 2020-2021 on October 5. The results of this study confirm our data on the learner enrollments and survey form, which DepEd deployed around the same time as this study is being conducted. For instance, the challenges that were discussed by Nash earlier, which relates to are similar, this relates to access to technology such as gadgets and internet. Also, similar to RECOVR, DepEd is also understanding the situation on the ground through the enrollment and survey data. We are getting the context and stories in the numbers that we collect. As of August 28, at least 85% of the learners from previous school year are already enrolled for this coming class opening, of which at least 91% are enrolled in public schools. While many have indicated not to enroll their children to school if class start in August, our latest enrollment shows that over time, households eventually gained confidence in sending their children to school. Many factors could have contributed to this, and for DepEd, we have been strengthening local support to encourage households to send their children back to school. Of course, the absolute number of the remaining learners who are yet to enroll remains huge. And this is a situation that calls for a strengthened campaign and advocacy to send these children back to school this year. The new enrollment guidelines that DepEd issued for this school year is specifically designed to collect data on the status of learners and the capacity of households to support various learning modalities such as access to appropriate technology, availability of adult support to learning, special learning needs, medical condition, among other things. These are important information for DepEd in designing policies and programs for the upcoming school year. Following the deployment of the LESF, DepEd also developed the Basic Education Learning Continuity Plan. This was the development of this plan was participated by our partners in the agency and from the national level up to the local level. This is in response to the new challenges in delivering basic education services to our learners. The BELCP contains the adoption of the most essential learning competencies and guided the designing of learning modalities, as well as the identification of appropriate technology to deliver the learning modalities for this year. The plan also enumerated critical policies to enable the implementation of new programs with sufficient governance support, such as human resources, financial systems, among other things. Further, all DepEd regional offices prepared their respective BELCP to capture the local situation, localize implementation of programs, and engage local stakeholders to support the provision of basic education services. This is in acknowledgement of the complexity of the situation and also the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing in the education sector. While online learning is the more popular mode, and this is of course confirmed in the presentation of Nash earlier, that emerged during the early part of the quarantine period, DepEd explored options to maximize available resources and address limitation in the internet connectivity. Hence, we are also implementing radio and TV-based education and modular learning. In fact, in our LESF result, a large portion of the enrolled learners this year prefers modular at 39% compared to online learning. Of course, this is confirmed by the challenges that were identified also in the LESF, which is most likely leaned on access to gadget and internet connectivity. DepEd is very much aware that this pandemic furthers equity gap. not only between poor and non-poor, but also with other marginalized groups. For instance, children with special needs who could have difficulty in the learning modalities would be needing additional support, not only from parents and teachers, but also from the community. Hence, inclusive education programs are being reviewed and recalibrated in preparation for the upcoming school year to arrest the potential widening of gap in basic education access. DepEd is also strengthening learner support services such as health and nutrition. So this was also mentioned in the study. School-based feeding program will remain in effect this school year. As to health concerns, we have been focusing on the psychosocial support to our learners and teachers to manage mental stress and anxiety related to this pandemic. The mobilization of local and international education partners through the Education Forum was done in late 2019. This provided an important role not only in generating support, but also in broadening our understanding of the issues and challenges brought by COVID-19 in the education sector. Households, especially parents or guardians, are DepEd's primary partner this year. Based on our LESF result, 48% of the enrolled learners will be supported by their parents or guardians in their home-based learning. But we are also aware that they need support as they look after the home-based education of their children. With this, parents and guardians will be part of the training programs of DepEd. Learning support aides will also be engaged to provide further assistance to parents and guardians who may have difficulty in participating in their child's education. Many of the learners who are returning to school this year are from private schools, while some of them transferred to public schools. Many are still deciding on whether to enroll or not. And as we know, this could be an economic impact of COVID-19 to households which affected their children's schooling. With this, through tuition fee subsidy, DepEd maintained support to learners who intend to enroll in private schools. DepEd is also planning to improve the policy environment to private education. Finally, we know that the situation will continuously evolve given the scope and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, BLCP specifically highlights the value of evidence through research and monitoring and evaluation to better understand the situation on the ground and the responsiveness of our policies and programs. We will continue to participate in policies discussions such as this, both local and international, and analyze evidence so we can appropriately adjust our strategies. Perhaps DepEd could also initiate policy discussions with our local counterparts to better understand how our programs and policies are being responsive to the education challenges that our schools, learners, and parents are encountering during this coming school year. So yeah, that's it. Again, thank you, IPA, for having us in this event, and thank you everyone for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Mariel, for your insights and for sharing DepEd's programs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's discuss RECOVR survey's economic activity and employment section. Under this section, we ask respondents how the pandemic is affecting their work, how is it affecting their incomes, as well as the enabling factors for continuation of work. Okay, here are some key government policies to consider. Under this section, as you can see, the Department of Labor and Employment issued guidelines and flexible work arrangements to mitigate the risk of termination of services or total closure of establishments. Government also approved the wage subsidy package for small business workers affected by the lockdown. The Department of Trade and Industry and the DOLE issued interim guidelines for institutions operating during the quarantine period, as well as the resumption of public transport operations given the OTR, or the Department of Transportation, issued protocols as well. Next, please. First, we can see that almost 7 out of 10 respondents worked for 1 or more hours in February, but only 4 out of 10 worked at all in the week prior to the survey, which is a notable drop in employment in the survey. Of those who did not work in the past week, 58% cited their business being closed due to quarantine measures. We can see that businesses were suffering during this time. Most respondents who worked in the past week worked from home or used flexible work arrangements, with more women more likely than men to work from home or use flexible work arrangements. This seems to be an enabling factor for continuation of work during this period, and suggests that flexible work arrangements or work from home policies allow respondents to continue working during the pandemic. We observed that in Region 8, or the Eastern Visayas region, respondents mostly report that they were no longer working in the week before the survey. Men were more likely than women to have worked during February of this year, and the employment gap between men and women has grown when looking at those who have worked in the past week. Of those who are still working, more than half of respondents reported a decrease in earnings. Respondents in all sectors were similarly likely to have worked prior to lockdown measures earlier this year, while respondents working in agriculture were more likely to have worked in the past week. Of those still working, respondents working in manufacturing and retail were slightly more likely to report decreased earnings. We see the economic impacts of COVID-19 as 64% of employed individuals have spent fewer hours working compared to when the COVID-19 crisis started to affect the Philippines in February. Women, more likely than men, have spent fewer hours working than they did in a typical week in February this year. Poorer respondents are more likely to have spent fewer working hours or have stopped working compared to a typical week before the COVID-19 crisis started to affect the country. Respondents in services and manufacturing, as well as retail, were more likely to have spent fewer working hours than they did in February. These results suggest that the economic impacts of COVID-19 have fallen on these sectors, specifically women and the poor. Respondents in all sectors were similarly likely to have worked in February 2020, while respondents working in agriculture were more likely to have worked in the past week prior to the survey in June. So those in agriculture were more likely to have worked, while those in manufacturing and retail were likely to report a decreased earnings. And those in services and manufacturing actually spent fewer hours working. From the survey results, we see that businesses have suffered during this time. The government has created the small business wage subsidy program to provide support to small business workers affected by the pandemic. Is the program providing support or adequately providing support to those who need it most? 41% of those who had worked in February reported that they did not work in the past week from the time of the survey. More than half, or 58%, cited their business being closed as the reason. How can government help people who have lost their jobs and employers that closed business operations? Here to share insights on economic activity and employment, I'm happy to call on Dr. Aniceto Orbeta from the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Dr. Babes, turning over to you.
Thanks, Nas. Being a researcher, rather than an implementer like my co-panelist, my discussion will be more on the plausibility of the numbers and what are its implications. So that should be the nature of most of my comments on the labor market and economic impact. So first, let me start with the overall unemployment rate. The survey measured about 60% unemployment rate in July from 30% in February. And comparing that with the national statistics in January, which round of the LFS, we got 5.3 in terms that refers to the last quarter of last year unemployment rate. Therefore, if you since there's methodologies are not the same, we can look at that as about 28% estimate over the national over the official numbers for the survey. So if we carry that forward, then by linear interpolation, we would expect that the unemployment rate would be around 32% by the official estimate in July or the second. And we find out the official estimates in April was 17.7%. That covers the first quarter of the year. So we'll see the employment numbers will be released next week, whether it'll be around 32%. So that would mean that the estimate that was given by the survey, RECOVR survey, will be on the dot. There were of course, other estimates on what happened to employment, like SWS measures joblessness. They measured it to be 17.5 in December 2019 and about 45.5 in July 2020, around the time of the survey as well. So that would be another estimate that you can use. Of course, we can also use the global mobility data for the Philippines, which is the base of 0 in January. The movement to place of work declined by 28%, and also the movement towards public transport platforms such as bus and train stations declined by 57% in around June. This is a continuing survey, so that you can learn that as well. So it's an assessment. I think the RECOVR estimate is in the high side, and then in terms of unemployment. And there are plausible explanations that we can take given the characteristic of the respondents. Although Elliott already mentioned that there were adjustments that will be done, but some of the things that can explain the high unemployment estimates would be, I'd say, younger cohort. Young people always have very high unemployment rates, and urban sample as well, which also has a higher unemployment rate than the rural sample. Highly educated means lower unemployment rate, but you combine highly educated and young people, that also means very high unemployment rate for many reasons, for most of which that the young educated can afford not to be employed right away. They tend to be choosy in terms of taking employment under the normal circumstances, of course. What we still have to know how they would react under a crisis situation. So these are some of the explanation, perhaps, of the high unemployment estimates of the survey. Let me go to the sectoral outcomes. Working the past last week's is highest in agriculture, next in manufacturing and retail, and lowest in services. So and fewer hours, highest in manufacturing, next in services, and last in agriculture, which is just the reverse. So the official statistics, if you would recall, was released in August for the second quarter GDP outcomes. The country had an unprecedented decline of about 16.5%, one of the highest in the region. And the survey predict, of course, as reflected that the last sector standing in quarter 2 was agriculture, which has a 0.1 growth rate. The largest contraction was in industry by 22%, and manufacturing by 21%, and services by 50, or about 16%. So the manufacturing volume index also declined to about 40%, by 40% in April, although it has slightly risen to 20% in June. So the outlook for the whole year by the planning agency is about a contraction about 4.5% to 6.6%. So the survey is correct about agriculture, but we have missed the bigger contraction in the industry compared to services. The mitigation policy, the basic mitigation policy for workers is, of course, apart from the SAP, is the SAP equivalent in the businesses, which provides a 2-month wage subsidy, called it wage subsidy, ranging from 8,000 pesos in NCR and the National Capital Region and Calabar Zone, and 5,000 to 6,000 for other regions. There's also a credit guarantee for loans for small, medium, and that was the main interventions for the business sector. Unfortunately, the country has never had an experience with the wage subsidy program of this scale. So there's also no working unemployment insurance program. So that could, this is one of the first things that the country experiencing. So nobody really knows how would it perform. So in terms of the, one can only try to predict what would happen. The way it's implemented is implemented to our social security system, the SSS. The identification and payments are done to the SSS. So by that, and the proviso is that it only covers firms that are not listed among the large taxpayers of the BIR. So if your firm is not among the large taxpayers, it's generally eligible, and some other things, minor things as qualifications. So since it is through the SSS, then theoretically it could cover mostly formal sector workers. So now, if you know the structure of the economy, there's an exceptionally large informal sector. For instance, if you just provide your numbers in 2016, establishments with 1 to 4 constitutes about 74% of all establishments. If you raise that to 1 to 9, that would be about 90% of the number of establishments. In terms of employment, firms with 1 to 4 employees, about 19%. I think raise that to 1 to 9, that would be 30%. So at the minimum, 90% of the establishments and 30% of the employees will be left out by the wage subsidy. So how do you, what are the better ways of reaching the informal sector? They are not registered anywhere. That's why by definition. So most people would say that you work with their organizations. This is not the organization that you organize for emergency purposes. This should be organizations that have been long-standing serving these groups, so that you will not have you will have the right beneficiaries in there, and that should be the design of this. You should work for this, which like the ones that has been demonstrated by the CCT is the long-standing relationship and systems developed to serve the poor has served well during the pandemic. It was very fast and very no issues, almost no issues in distributing the Social Amelioration Fund for CCT beneficiaries, as Raquel has mentioned. Because the systems are there, their bank accounts and all of that. But the biggest, that's only for 5 million households. But we are targeting 18 million for that. So whatever happened to the other 13 million is it's a lot of speculations about targeting the right people and giving to them on time. So establishing long-term relationships with organizations that serves the target beneficiaries should be a long-term goal for government, so that in times of emergencies they can tap them easily and without so much problem in terms of identifying the beneficiaries. I think that's at the end of my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Babes, and a big thank you to all of our panelists today. Unfortunately, we're running a bit over time, so we have tried to answer your questions via the Q&A chat. And if you'd like to reach out to us, I'd encourage you to email us at contact@povertyaction.org. You can also partner with us as a researcher, as a practitioner, or as a funder. So please feel free to reach out. You can also follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. And you can also visit our RECOVR website at www.poverty-action.org/recover. So a big thank you to all of you who attended today, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.